Thank you, David. Very excited today to have a new speaker. We love when we can partner with our friends at Lewis and Clark College. We have Kyle Lascurettes, who is Associate Professor of International Affairs at Lewis and Clark College in Portland. He specializes and teaches classes in international relations theory, global order, international organizations, and international security. His first book, Orders of Exclusion, it's an Oxford University Press book, in 2020 received the Jervis Schroeder Prize for Best Book in International History and Politics, presented by the American Political Science Association. And we couldn't have a more timely topic right now than the future of NATO. So big hand for Kyle.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tim. Thank you for inviting me. It's a real treat to be here. Thanks for having me here, and I'm very happy to be here, especially because I'm on sabbatical this spring, so I'm basically desperate to talk to somebody, anybody, about this kind of stuff, and I think my wife is sick of hearing about it, so happy to be here. Before moving on, as my hosts helpfully reminded me, an opportunity to plug an annual event in the spring at Lewis and Clark College as part of the International Affairs Department. Every spring, every April, in fact, we host an international affairs symposium that is free and open to the public, brings in speakers to have a series of debates around hot topics, contentious topics, and a steering committee of students has been working on this, as they always do, the entire academic year. I'm not sure if the full program has been announced yet, but I know that the keynote, one of the keynote participants has been announced, and it is former UN Ambassador John Bolton will be at Lewis and Clark. So I'm sure no controversy will be stirred up there at all. So our famously conservative campus as well. So I'm sure that will be great. Anyways, the symposium this year is taking place April 8th through 10th. At Lewis and Clark College, free and open to the public. On each of those 3 days, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, I believe, there will be 2 debates, one starting at 3:30 and the other starting at 7:30 in the evening. So, and you can find the program for that online, and we love getting community members, people beyond Lewis and Clark, to come to that. So, all right, just keeping my time here because I can be a little bit long-winded. So I will just, let's see if I can access this. Here's just a little bit of an outline as to what I'm going to talk about. I'll talk a little bit about NATO's origins, what makes NATO so special, focus a fair amount of attention on NATO's endurance and expansion after the Cold War, then Western versus Russian views of NATO today, and finally conclude with some thoughts about US politics and NATO. And I will look forward to your questions and the discussion about anything that I talk about or anything that I don't talk about as well. So. A bit about NATO's origins, just some review and background here, which I'll keep brief because I recognize that this is an informed group that I assume has done their homework in the form of the assigned reading, which is quite good. And if you haven't done the reading, don't worry about it, but it is quite good. So if you're interested in NATO, I'd recommend it to you. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, an alliance and international organization that was founded in 1949. Here's a picture of President Harry Truman signing it in the Oval Office. And it was founded in the early and tense years of the global Cold War, the superpower standoff between the United States and Soviet Union that lasted from the end of World War II through to the late 1980s. Or early 1990s. And this alliance or organization called NATO was founded for the purpose of bringing the United States and the democracies of Western Europe, well, mostly democracies, closer together in terms of security cooperation, that is military cooperation, to combat the state of the Soviet Union and the ideology of communism. And the United States and Europe both felt motivated to do this, and both felt they got something out of the agreement and the founding of NATO. For the United States, it was a way to get Europe serious about the perceived Soviet threat. More broadly, to get Europe serious about the dangers of the post-World War II world, and to commit the states of Europe to being on the American side on future issues and conflicts. And for Europe, it was about getting that elusive security guarantee from the famously skittish, isolationist, unilateralist Americans, and a promise that the USA would definitely, absolutely, with 100% no doubts, come to their aid in the event of an attack against any of them, and primarily an attack from the Soviet Union against any of them. And I want to argue here that there are three things, or I'll say there are at least three things. I'm going to focus on three things that have traditionally set NATO apart and made it particularly an important entity. One of the reasons we're still here talking about it 70-something years after its founding. The first is its collective security guarantee. Now, NATO has a lot of interesting parts and details, but by far the most important thing about it is Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty that brought NATO into existence. That is the Collective Security Pledge, which essentially says that all NATO members will consider an attack on one NATO member to be an attack against all of them, and that they will immediately come to the defense of that country attacked as if they themselves had been attacked. That is what collective security is, in essence. And this is especially important with NATO because, look, there are other alliances and international organizations out there that technically have a similar collective security pledge in them. The United Nations technically has a collective security pledge in it. But in the case of NATO, both its advocates and its opponents actually agree that NATO's members actually take this pledge extremely seriously. And so NATO membership really, truly matters. And it may be the one organization in the world where everybody, opponents and advocates alike, agree, yes, that Article 5 guarantee really is ironclad. I'll mention that the Soviets were always focused on, some would say obsessed with NATO throughout the Cold War. So much so that in reaction to NATO making a part of Germany a NATO member in 1955, the Soviets reacted by creating their own version of NATO, the Warsaw Treaty Organization, better known as the Warsaw Pact, an organization that in practice was just a rather heavy-handed contraption that was dominated by and run through Moscow, but was to the external world made to look just like NATO, so that the communist world would perhaps be seen as on equal legitimacy, equal footing with NATO. But this map here, this is how Europe looked from roughly 1955 to 1989 or so, characterized by these things. So the second thing that I want to argue sets NATO apart is its unusually close degree of security, diplomatic, and military coordination amongst its members. As the reading mentioned, the main decision-making arm of NATO, the North Atlantic Council in Brussels, has permanent representatives and delegations from all of NATO member countries, meaning they stay there all of the time, ready to continuously meet and work and consult together. And I always tell the students in my international organizations class that if an organization has permanent ambassadors, rather than just occasionally sending a foreign minister or a president or something like that, that's usually a good sign that the organization has some heft behind it, that it's got some power and importance. Along with this is the much heralded Unified Military Command of NATO, which in practice means that on NATO missions, the organization is run more like a single country's military than, I would argue, any other alliance or international organization in the world. So if you're more familiar with the European Union, and the EU has thus far been the pinnacle of advanced economic cooperation in the world, I think you could make the case that NATO is or has been the pinnacle of advanced military cooperation and coordination in the world. The final reason to focus so much on NATO is maybe the most straightforward one. It has remained the premier security organization of choice for the most powerful country on the planet, the United States of America. Simply put, we talk a lot about NATO because since its founding, when the USA has wanted to go multilateral, work with other countries in its foreign security operations, it has most often chosen to do so through NATO, not through the Organization of American States, not even through the UN, but through NATO. And just an aside on that last point, I wanted to note something about the relationship between NATO and the United Nations, which your reading portrays as NATO being incredibly deferential to the UN, and in a lot of ways that's certainly true. But what is also true is that NATO was founded, only fewer than 5 years after the UN had been founded, and NATO was founded in part because of profound disillusionment in the West with the United Nations in those early years, particularly in the United States. American leaders hated the emerging stalemate in the UN Security Council, where the United States and the Soviet Union both had an unconditional veto to block any decisive action in the military and security sphere in foreign policy and international relations. And so you've actually got top US officials saying when NATO is founded, hey, this is actually the UN 2.0. This is what we should have done the first time around, where there's no veto, and more importantly, no Russia, no Soviet Union. It's a smaller club of more Western like-minded states, mostly democracies, and perhaps for that reason, it's been the United States' preferred multilateral vehicle for exercising influence in the world, even above the UN. And so, as your reading says, the relationship between the UN and NATO is often positive and complementary. Just one example of this. In 2011, in the midst of the Arab Spring revolutions across the Middle East and North Africa, the UN passed a number of resolutions essentially authorizing the international community to take action in the country of Libya to stop mass atrocities there. And they authorized this action through NATO. So essentially the UN delegated the military mission in Libya to NATO to carry out. So complementary. Yet this isn't always the case, and this isn't always the relationship. Another example, in 1999, the United States and some of its European allies were urging further intervention in the Balkans, specifically in Kosovo. In the UN Security Council, further action on this front is blocked by China, but especially by Russia, that did not want the authorization, use their veto or threaten their veto at least. What does the United States do? It goes around the United Nations by seeking and receiving military intervention via NATO. And this is still something that I would say, even to this day, has left a rather bad taste in the mouths of China, certainly, but especially Russia, perhaps amongst other countries. So that relationship between the two isn't always complementary and perfectly harmonious. And on this note, I now want to turn to post-Cold War NATO endurance and expansion. And I know there's a lot going on here, but I'll keep it up here for a minute, just if you're interested in kind of the waves of NATO membership and NATO expansion. I'll admit that more of my preparation for this talk than I'd care to admit came with trying to match the colors of the text here with the colors of the diagram, and perhaps failing. But So let's move from 1949, creation of NATO, to 1989 to 1991, when we suddenly witnessed the disintegration, first of the Soviet Union's informal empire in Eastern Europe, its de facto sphere of influence over nominally independent countries like East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and so on. And then pretty quickly thereafter, the dissolution of the actual country of the Soviet Union itself, which created newly independent countries like Georgia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and perhaps most notably for our interest in the news today, Ukraine. And one of the things that was remarkable in these years is that these years that we now think of as the end of the Cold War, late 1980s, early 1990s, is that while the Soviets end up disbanding the Warsaw Pact, NATO continues to endure at that point and all the way to today, which is why we're talking about it. Which, if you think about it, and I think the reading gets at this a bit towards the end, NATO's endurance is objectively surprising after the Cold War. Here's an alliance and organization that was explicitly founded to unite against the Soviet threat. This threat weakens in the late 1980s and then collapses entirely by 1991, and yet NATO endures. And it doesn't just endure, it actually, in the post-Cold War period, expands. Most notably, it expands by adding new members in Eastern Europe, countries that had either been part of the Soviet sphere of influence, like Hungary and Poland, or countries that weren't even countries during the Cold War and were simply parts of the Soviet Union proper itself, countries today like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And this expansion into former Soviet-controlled territories begins in 1999 with the ascension of the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland into NATO, then continues with another wave of expansion in 2004 that includes Bulgaria, Romania, and the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and continues numerous subsequent times with additional countries joining in recent years. Montenegro in 2017, North Macedonia just in 2020, Finland late last year, the newest NATO member, and anyone in the audience know who's very likely, very soon to be the newest NATO member in 2024? Sweden, yes, not official yet, but just around the corner. So it will happen here very soon. Another membership development that I want to briefly mention here, we can come back to it if you want, is that with the enthusiastic support of the United States, NATO publicly announced in 2008 that it would at some point in the undefined future offer membership to the countries of Georgia and Ukraine. Not a lot of formal progress has been made on this ever since, but in retrospect, this moment was in some ways perhaps the opening of Pandora's box and has been looming out there ever since, particularly for Russia. Now, as one can imagine, this expansion of what was once an explicitly anti-Soviet, anti-Russian alliance into territory that was a short time earlier considered part of the USSR, well, this does not exactly sit well with post-Soviet Russia. Even in the 1990s and early 2000s, when relations between the West, really the United States and Russia, were a lot warmer than they are now or have been in the last 10 plus years, even then it didn't sit well with Russia. And my point in bringing all of this up is that NATO expansion in the 1990s and early 2000s is a real source of tension between Russia and the West, perhaps the core source of tension between Russia and the West. So a reasonable question that follows from all of this, well, was NATO expansion justified? And I think where you come down on that question might go a long way to explaining where you stand, not necessarily on the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, which I think we can all agree is horrible and lamentable and tragic, but at least on Russia's relationships with the states along its borders, its relationship with Europe, and its with the broader international community. And so I want to take a little time to just think about this from the two sides' perspectives. So let's start with Russia's perspective. What they say today is, look, NATO expansion into Eastern Europe didn't happen at the height of the Cold War. It began in the 1990s, mere years after the Cold War was declared finished, and amidst Western assurances that Russia was now not a rival or a threat, but a friend and a partner, one which would be welcomed into the so-called liberal international order of which NATO is a part, would be fully welcomed into the community of nations in a way that the Soviet Union never had been. And one of the reasons NATO expansion was seen as so needlessly provocative from Moscow's perspective to Russia was that it was interpreted as a profound breaking of a pledge that the United States was said to have made to Moscow in the summer of 1990. At the time, the Soviet Union and the United States were engaged in fierce negotiations over the reunification of Germany, East Germany and West Germany just becoming Germany again, and whether there were going to be limits placed on the autonomy of reunified Germany to choose its own alliances and alignments in world politics. Reluctantly at first, but eventually definitively, the last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, gave in to American and Western demands on this, and he conceded that a reunified Germany could join the NATO alliance if that was the will of its people. And so it did so. Reunified Germany joins NATO. But in exchange for relenting on this front, Gorbachev supposedly gets a direct promise made, not officially, but in private, by then Secretary of State James Baker, and the two are pictured here, Baker and Gorbachev. Gorbachev supposedly gets a promise in private from Baker that beyond this point, NATO would not expand, would expand its membership, quote, not 1 inch eastward after that. James Baker and the US government, of course, both deny that any such promise was made. But if you want to identify the single largest grievance in geopolitical terms that has led to Russian feelings of antipathy and resentment towards the United States, towards Western Europe, towards NATO, towards many of the states formerly part of the Soviet bloc, it's the perception that they were profoundly lied to, deceived, betrayed, and on this most important promise by the global superpower that it would not allow an anti-Soviet, anti-Russian alliance to expand anywhere closer to Russia's borders. And what we went from was not 1 inch in James Baker's promise to every single inch, which is what President Joe Biden pledged in his State of the Union address in 2022, shortly after the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine, in reference to the United States' continuing commitment to protect every inch of every NATO country's territory. So that's the Russian side. On the other side, advocates of NATO expansion in the West, namely here in the United States, will tell you that NATO expansion happened not because existing NATO countries of the West were pushing for it, but because there was enormous demand for the security protections that NATO membership afforded. A demand that came because of the very grave and still existential threat that Russia still posed and still poses for states formerly in the Soviet Union sphere of influence, for their security, for their survival, even after the conclusion of the Cold War. And from the perspective of states like, say, Estonia or Poland, the only reason they say they aren't the ones getting pushed around by Russia in the way that Ukraine is today and Georgia has been, is precisely because of their NATO membership and the Article 5 guarantees that come along with that membership. And so to me, asking whether it is the menace and aggression of Russia or the menace and expansion of NATO that's responsible for all of the current problems is a bit like asking whether the chicken or the egg came first. And in this haphazard analogy, Russia's the chicken. Don't tell Vladimir Putin I said that. But advocates of this perspective say NATO expansion is the only thing keeping the current war from also being an invasion of Poland, Hungary, Lithuania, and so on. On the other side, NATO is the egg. And defenders of the Russian position would say Russia's relations with its smaller neighbors wouldn't have deteriorated so much as they have without the poison of NATO endurance and expansion that brought Western influence and, importantly, Western weapons much further east than they had ever been before, in a way that represents an enduring and perhaps really an existential threat to Russian security. Now, regardless of where one stands on this issue, the ironic development is that since the end of the Cold War, nothing has united NATO and given it forward momentum more than this Russian invasion of Ukraine. That was, at least in part, a product of a fear of NATO and Western influence on Russia's part. And the ascension or soon-to-be ascension of Finland and Sweden into NATO is perhaps the best evidence of this. These are two historically, some would say notoriously, neutral and independent countries that while they have gradually pursued greater cooperation with NATO over the years, had never realistically given serious thought to joining the alliance since at least Sweden had done so, had debated doing so when NATO was founded and decided against joining at that time. This invasion changed all of that. Both countries have been reassessing their security policies, and it looks to be that, well, Finland is already in, Sweden is basically a done deal, and NATO has expanded, therefore, further in dramatic ways. That said, there's perhaps an even deeper and darker irony in thinking about NATO's future. NATO's very existence speaks to a concern over transatlantic ties between Europe and the United States. That's its entire reason for being. Yet if we think that NATO has an uncertain future today, many would say this has less to do with the fraying transatlantic ties and much more to do with fraying ties within the United States, fraying ties across partisan lines, and fraying beliefs in the utility of the American commitment to NATO. There's been a notable drop-off in conservative or Republican support for NATO in recent years. And I think that this is one of the things that can be attributed largely to the individual of former President Donald Trump himself. Trump is famously not a policy guy, foreign policy or otherwise. But I would actually say that Trump did come into office in 2017 with an enduring belief regarding American foreign policy that he actually consistently held throughout his adult life. And that enduring belief is America is getting screwed by the rest of the world. In economics, we're getting screwed by free trade agreements like NAFTA and the WTO. But in security and diplomacy, we're getting screwed by agreements like NATO, where we provide all the security for Europe, and what do we get for it? These soft European, mostly liberals, get all of the safety and security from the United States, and a number of them can't even bother to spend the measly 2% of their GDP on defense like they pledged to do when joining NATO. And I think that the Republican Party's position on NATO has very much been influenced by Trump, perhaps on this issue more than on any other single issue. But more broadly, than even this observation and talking about Trump and Trumpism, and I'll stop for your questions after this. We've observed across the political spectrum in this country, we are seeing a generational shift with political power slowly moving away from folks that lived significant formative years of their lives during the Cold War and were able to witness the perceived Soviet threat, and political power slowly moving towards younger generations that have only lived their formative adult years in the post-Cold War era, myself included. And this is most, I think, pronounced in the Republican Party when it comes to NATO and foreign policy. And we can see that even now. The old guard in the US Senate, for example, Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, the old guard are still staunch supporters of NATO, funding the war in Ukraine, and so on. It's the newer, younger guard that is following Trump more and questioning things that were unquestionable for earlier generations, including the American commitment to NATO. But we can see signs of this on the left with Democrats as well. If not quite as much on NATO, then certainly on issues like the traditionally close relationship between the United States and Israel. The old guard still strongly supports that tight, close relationship, still strongly supports Israel, while the younger generations have questioned that in unprecedented ways. So in general, I think a lot of this comes down to historical memory, or perhaps lack of historical memory, over big aspects of what we often call the post-war international order born in the 1940s, of which NATO is a significant part. And what for earlier generations was the perceived necessity of these components of the post-war order born in the 1940s, that is now, that its utility is being questioned in a lot of ways like it never has been before, and I think will continue to be questioned regardless of which of these guys wins the election this year. And I think with that, I will wrap things up, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Kyle. I'm going to start with a question from our audience at home. And you sort of ended on a perfect note for this. In light of recent reckless comments, which I guess one could clarify as being a repo man approach to diplomacy and statecraft, in terms of GDP, how much has the US spent as compared to other countries, keeping in mind Canada is also a member, and will Sweden and Finland help with the funding model?
Good question. I'm not sure that let's see, I brought just this information, a little bit dated, but comparing 2014 to 2023 in terms of defense expenditure as a share of countries' GDP. And what the green line there in the middle shows is every country that is to the right of that, at least by these measures, have not been meeting that pledge to NATO defense spending in this regard. So I'll say in terms of burden sharing and actual spending in a way that affects military missions, the United States is still by far the vast majority contributions of military materiel and funding in NATO. And so, no, I do not at all anticipate that those two members are going to tip the balance in some ways. I would say a lot of this is much more of a perceptions game. It's not necessarily that hitting that 2% spending or being above it is necessarily going to be a sea change in how NATO operates, what it can and can't do, but it's been taken as a sign of countries' commitment not just to NATO, but to defending themselves and to contributing their fair share to the alliance. So if anything, I think it's probably more of a political issue than it is kind of an actual issue of money or tanks or bombs or those kinds of things.
Could you speak to, well, appreciate your comments, great presentation. You spoke to the sort of a generational shift in terms of importance of the NATO commitment, but I'm wondering if you could also speak to, particularly in a modern generation, but I'll go back to Vietnam, public skepticism that attended, did we do the right thing in Vietnam? Did we do the right thing in Iraq? Did we do the right thing in Afghanistan? I mean, a lot of that reporting has been, hey, the old guard told us this is what we have to do. And oh, by the way, we kind of missed the boat on that. So, I don't know how prevalent that skepticism might be in a younger generation, but I can certainly see how it would come back to bite a commitment, a NATO commitment.
Right, right. I think it's a great question, a really interesting question. So the way that I interpret what you're saying here is, I was talking at the end about kind of a sea change in historical memory about the utility of things like NATO and the NATO alliance, but there's also constantly kind of politics over the historical memory of other aspects of American foreign policy, including interventionism and kind of activism versus restraint, internationalism versus isolationism or neo-isolationism and those kinds of things. And I'd have to think more about kind of the cross-section of those things, but I think you're certainly right to note that there is, once again, perhaps akin to after the decade or so after the Vietnam War, there is more skepticism of American American interventionism abroad than there has been in quite some time, in part because of blowback from some of the conflicts and interventions that you mentioned. I will say how that might impact NATO. In the past, when there's been this skepticism of American interventionism, alliances and commitments like NATO have often, not always, but often been thought of as actually good for those espousing that skepticism, because NATO, the Article 5 guarantees and commitments are in place as a deterrent, okay? So NATO isn't supposed to actually drag, kind of chain gang the United States into conflicts. It is supposed to be the ultimate deterrent that actually keeps the peace and keeps the United States out of foreign adventures. That lately seems to have gotten turned on its head a bit, in debates in this country about funding for Ukraine. And, I think, again, a lot of this has to do with perhaps former President Trump's inartful conflating of interventionism, foreign wars, and America's NATO commitments, perhaps because of the way that has manifested itself in debates over the Ukraine war and the role of NATO right on the borders there. But so I would say that, the American NATO commitment doesn't necessarily have to go away with an increasing skepticism of US interventionism, but it seems in practice that it is more today than it was perhaps in the past, even after Vietnam.
Professor, we got a question from our audience on Zoom relevant to the discussion of Russian aggression. You talked a little bit about this, but you could dive into it more, please. Here's the question, quote, given Russian fears of having an adversary on its western border, did the U.S. and Western Europe blow it by expanding to Russia's doorstep, and was there a failure of imagination after the fall of the Soviet Union to establish a different security arrangement for the former Soviet states, end quote?
I think that is a fantastic question, and that's for me, one of the big what-ifs in history, and in history at the end of the 20th century. What else could have been done? And one of the things that I actually really liked about the reading for today, the chapter that we looked at, and that I actually hadn't read before, was towards the end, some quotes from George H.W. Bush's National Security Advisor at the time, Brent Scowcroft, expressing actual kind of remorse and skepticism about continuing on with NATO unquestioningly at the end of the Cold War. And what I can tell you from my own research and my own work and just personal fascination with the end of the Cold War is that it was an unquestioned assumption in US policy circles, in the White House, all of the principal players, that NATO must endure. That actually what Mikhail Gorbachev wanted and proposed was scrapping not just the Warsaw Pact, but NATO. These are relics of the Cold War. We're saying we're moving beyond that. Let's build something new. Let's build a new world order in Europe that will be more inclusive, kind of pan-Eurasian alliances and institutions and organizations. And the United States said no, pretty definitively, pretty forcefully. And I do think that part of that is a lack of imagination. Then again, that might be easy for me to say, or for us to say. We weren't there pulling the levers on decision making, and the policymakers at the time said NATO has been great for us. NATO may be part of why we have won the Cold War. Or have a negotiated end of this. Why would we voluntarily give up something that we already know for some nebulous future thing that we don't know, we might not be able to control? When is that ever rational? So yeah, I do think, I think there's much more investigation and soul searching to be done on realistic alternatives at that critical juncture at the end of the Cold War. And I think people are just starting to grapple with it.
Yes. How do you see the situation in the Ukraine playing out over the next 5 to 8 years? There's been talk of, cutting a dirty deal with Russia in exchange for a NATO guarantee of a remaining territory of the Ukraine, integration into the EU, and so on. And what do you think the more likely outcomes are here? And I guess part of this question is, to what degree do you see the European countries, from a defense point of view, starting to act more at the EU level than at the individual state level?
Well, I'm not good questions. I'm not an EU expert, but I know we've been waiting for more decisive security action on the EU front for quite some time now, and that's not to say that developments haven't been made, but so far those haven't really come to fruition. I've been wrong so many times on Russia-Ukraine that I almost I'm watchful to put myself on the record with this again, but hey, why not be wrong again for all future generations to be able to see on YouTube? I think some sort of negotiated settlement has to be eventually what is coming. The trick will be for it to come at a point when neither side feels like continuing the war could possibly move that negotiated settlement more in their direction. And what that settlement looks like, I'm not sure. It will almost certainly involve Russia being able to take home some amount of small territorial gains, in addition to maybe some specific, but more likely some vague diplomatic promise on the status of Ukraine. So I really find it hard to see an agreement ending with a pledge that Ukraine never joins NATO, but I could see some sort of pledge that is a bit more nebulous than that, something about Ukraine's neutral status going forward, or that it won't needlessly provocatively join in one side or the other. What that looks like, I'm not sure, and I think we've got still a ways to go until we get there. An unsatisfying answer, I know, but that's what I got for you.
We have a question from the back of the room, and then we'll go back up to the front of the room.
I'm aware that Finland and Sweden, because of Ukraine, requested membership, but I noticed on the map that Switzerland and Austria, and it looked like Ireland are not part of it. And I understand the Swiss situation. They recently joined UN, but they haven't joined the EU. But I was kind of surprised about Austria, and I just wondered what you know about those countries.
I think Austria it was more a part of Austrian foreign policy than it was about NATO. So Austria, in the midst of the Cold War, I believe in the 1950s, sought kind of neutrality and sought very self-consciously to be seen and perceived as a neutral arbiter between the West and East, between Warsaw Pact and NATO. And I think right now the current situation is just a legacy of that. Actually, I haven't checked in on Austria much to know if there have been further debates about NATO, but my understanding has always been that they were in the position that Sweden and Finland were in before this most recent war. That is, the policy was, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And there's no need to garner further commitments on this front. So, but yeah, interesting question. Really, especially when you teach international organizations, trying to figure out and remember which European states are members of NATO but not members of the EU and vice versa is crazy, and often has to do with like very particular historical legacies having to do with each individual country. But always a good question.
It seems to us that in the West that it's ridiculous that that NATO would ever be aggressive against Russia. Listening to Putin talk to Tucker Carlson, which was a deal on Russian history, but he mentioned that right after he took over in around 2000, he offered to join NATO. And I'd never heard this before. I don't know if it's true or not. And then I've heard recently speculation that Putin doesn't worry about NATO militarily. He worries about the Western way of life. Say if it took over in Ukraine and Ukraine joined, and that's his big worry. Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, good questions and observations. Yes, Russian leaders, not just Putin, but before him Yeltsin, I believe, and I know for a fact that in the negotiations at the end of the Cold War, Gorbachev asked this too. Well, okay, you want Germany to join NATO? Can we join NATO? Can everyone join NATO? And the United States always has kind of equivocated on that and said, well, that would be getting too big. We would kind of dilute the utility of the alliance and such. But don't worry about it, because we're not anti-Soviet. We're not anti-Russian anymore. And in fact, I mean, to its credit, NATO did and has taken anti-Soviet, anti-Russian language out of its founding documents and kind of officially moved its mission beyond that. But yeah, part of my point in harping a bit on the Russian side of things is I think regardless of what you think about Putin and Russian aggression in starting this invasion of Ukraine, I do think that there is room for empathy there, and empathy meaning putting yourself in Russia's shoes, okay, a literal definition of empathy, identifying with their perspective. And if the Cold War had gone the other way, or regardless of the Cold War, would the United States be comfortable with an expanding Warsaw Pact, moving into the Caribbean, moving into beyond Cuba, Dominican Republic, Bahamas, Mexico, Canada, okay, joining another state sphere of influence. Even if Russia or China or whoever you want to talk about said, look, this isn't an anti-American group. This is about us providing security for a better world. And then you say, yeah, okay, but you're surrounding the United States here, okay? So I do think that there is there is some legitimate grounds for grievance and security concerns on Russia's part. As to the other question, whether it's more a security or a political fear, I mean, I think it's both. I think most existentially, it's a threat about creeping westward influence, moving closer and closer to Russia's borders, and Russia continuing to see itself as losing from the end of the Cold War, not only losing de facto allies and large parts of the former Soviet Union, their country itself, but now losing any kind of special relationship with those countries on its border because of Western influence, because of NATO. At the same time, there's a military threat. There's a military threat there too, and this has bubbled up at various times in Russian concerns over nuclear weapons and possible anti-missile defense systems being placed in countries like Poland and the Czech Republic, and what this does to Russia's ability to defend itself and defend its borders in world politics. So I think it's too simple to say it's one or the other. I think it's both.
So we're coming up on time, but in hearing you talk, I had a couple thoughts. One is, World Oregon is part of the World Affairs Councils of America network. And we were founded really sort of coming out of this moment of international organizations and thinking about our role on the global stage. And, we're involved in the discussion of mutual understanding. We're involved in citizen diplomacy. And yet we're seeing a push toward a very sort of pugnacious, never give an inch stance. And in November, Derek and I were in Washington, D.C. for our annual conference, and Ambassador Thomas Pickering was given a Lifetime Achievement Award. And this is a towering figure. And he was ambassador to Russia and Jerusalem, and he was Jordan. And he was an amazing figure, and no one expected him to get up and give a talk. And he was talking specifically about Gaza, but he could have been talking about Ukraine, and he was talking about that these sort of conflicts are not going to be won on the battlefield. And you're an educator, so part of your role is reaching a generation of folks who are hopefully interested in international relations, in the international order, in diplomacy. How hopeful are you when you look at the students that you're talking to about the systems we've had, the systems we have now, and the future?
Do you want a good wrap-up answer, or do you want a true answer?
You can give me both.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I will say I'm hopeful that there is an emerging or future generation of leaders that I see, and my students are fantastic at Lewis and Clark and going into international affairs, and I wholeheartedly support and try pushing as many promising ones as possible towards the State Department, towards the Foreign Service, towards government service. And I'm hopeful that if we continue to emphasize history and historical memory, and this is one of my pet peeves in the study of political science and international affairs, that it needs to have a heavily historical component, because we're not going to understand the potential necessity of the way that things are without understanding why they came into being. And I am hopeful in that when I see smart students learning history and absorbing history and reading primary documents and reading accounts of what the Cold War, World War II, the Great Depression were like, they suddenly understand more why the IMF exists as it does, or the UN, or NATO. And so I'm hopeful in that regard. I am less hopeful in regards to the inevitable fading of that historical memory. I think it is just a product of human relations that as much as we try to preserve those memories, we do lose something as past generations fade away out of power first and then aren't around to pass down those living experiences of the Cold War. You can read about the Cold War all you want in as many books as you want. That's not the same as being there or having a trusted parent or grandparent or what have you who was there and can tell you what it was like. And so in that regard, you know, I'm somewhat skeptical, and I would say maybe not fearful, but not exactly optimistic about the enduringness of the so-called liberal international order. So, and on that note, you know, obviously, Trump and Trumpism and American Firstism is not great for that order, but I happen to think that if it wasn't Trump, it was going to be somebody else coming along anyways. I think these kinds of disruptors and questions and criticisms that Trump have been making are more and more inevitable as a part of our politics the farther away from World War II and especially the Cold War we get over time. So unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, I think we're going to see more of that questioning of previously unquestionable things than less going forward.
That is a really wonderful, candid answer, and thank you very much. Big hand for Kyle.
Thank you. Thanks.
And just a reminder to folks in the room, if you have missed a program and you want to see a program, all 4 of the most recent programs are on YouTube. If you have questions about that, go to YouTube, type in World Oregon, all one word under the search, and our page will pop up and you can see any of them. You can share them with all of your family. And this one will be up probably next week. So thanks a lot. Have a safe week, and we will see you next time.